Holocaust, it would have been difficult to say that it wasn't really bad. So that's why, these questions had an impact in that sense. This, in fact, created, and for different reasons, different politicians, but also, sadly, historians, were engaged in this myth of a benign form of fascism vis-a-vis Nazism. Because, of course, if you are not like the Nazis, you have to be better. I mean, the Nazis being the most, and it's true, the most extreme example of extreme right politics, which is to say, to a great extent, fascism. That is not a definition of fascism, but fascism certainly is that. And this is the context in which, again and again, the question of fascism and the Holocaust comes to the fore, and it was answered, and it will be answered, certainly in different ways, as contexts are changing as well. Of course, in our current context, the question is certainly way more important than it was before. And in a way, we are way more connected in asking these questions. What is the future of our democracy? Are we going to be, suffering in terms of, diversity and pluralism? And these questions kind of bypass the many decades that we live and our parents lived before and connects us to the 1930s and 1940s. So, I mean, in a way, it's very organic that we connect to those times. And in fact, we know that the general that was like the most important military person in America at the time, when he saw the events of January 6th, he thought about those times. And that is not a lack of context. That I don't think that is a ahistorical view. I mean, and again, as Professor Gurevich was saying, the question is how you make the connection. If it's a way to see parallels, is one thing. If it's a total conflation between past and present, then it becomes problematic. I mean, and then on the other hand, you see even historians, some of them very famous, saying, well, this is not like the Nazis, because, and this is a kind of, I will simplify it, because this guy doesn't have Hitler's mustache, or it's not Hitler. Or, I mean, nobody says about the mustache, but the idea is that this is not Hitler. Well, of course it's not Hitler. Hitler was Hitler, and this guy is someone else. But the connections are there. The question is how similar, how different, how much continuity, how much change. So, because in fact, what is going on in the present and what went on in the past, this is part of the same history. And you can call this history the history of fascism, if you want. You can call this history the history of xenophobia, if you want, or you can call it the history of those that are against democracy. And again, or against liberal democracy or constitutional democracy. And then you see the connections if you want to see them. But this is not a question of, the will to see them, but rather to focus our study or to focus our analysis in those connections. So this is not about the uniqueness of the past or fascism or the Holocaust, but about these global connections. Now, I will switch now to two dimensions of this issue of fascism and the Holocaust. Before all that, because you might be wondering, and there are many definitions out there, I mean, what is fascism? I mean, that could be, I could talk for hours on that, and I would be also not very satisfied because it's a difficult question to answer, and yet many of my works, I try to answer that question by by problematizing it. I mean, to say, okay, this is very difficult to explain, but we can understand it better by seeing all these angles. And yet, in the book I'm writing, I'm supposed to deliver the final draft in a few months. I really forced myself to focus on 4 things that fascism was about. Fascism was many things, but these 4 things, other political ideologies or movements or regimes did not have in the same way. I was asking this question to fascism because then, I mean, I published this book a couple of years ago, which is From Fascism to Populism in History. And what I say in this book is that after 1945, people that were fascists, at least many of them, not most of them, the ones that still like Hitler and Mussolini and they wanted to continue that project in the same way, we call them neo-Nazis, neo-fascists. They were a political minority until recently, and they were never successful in politics until recently. So the people that were smarter or more pragmatic among them changed. So the ones that remained like that never achieved power. They always were like political opposition and so on. And that's another history. But the history of populism is the history, at least in its beginnings, of people that used to be authoritarian fellow travelers of fascism or even fascists and decided after 1945 that it was time to change. Whether they meant it, they felt it, or they wanted to be in power, that's a difficult question to answer. Like Eric Hobsbawm, this famous historian of the 19th and 20th century, said, well, with the advent of mass politics, once we have mass politics, we will never know again, even when we study a politician as a source, what they truly think. And it's impossible to know. But we know what they do. And what they did is basically what I call a reformulation of fascism in democratic, in a democratic key. The result was populism, which was this authoritarian take on democracy. And yet, it was this combination that made them differently to fascists. And in fact, in this analysis that they did the opposite of what the fascists did. The first cases were in my country, in Argentina, but also in Brazil, in Argentina with Juan Domingo Perón, in Brazil with Getulio Vargas, and many others, first in Latin America, then in other places. For the Q&A, if you ask me why Latin America, I can engage with that because I have asked myself that question and I try to answer it in my book. But the fact is that they did the opposite of what the fascists do. What do the fascists do? In the most famous cases, Italy and Germany, they use democracy to destroy it from within. Once they arrive to power through democratic means, they destroy democracy from within. The history of Perón, the first of these populist leaders, is different because Perón was a dictator. He was a strong man in a dictatorship, the Argentine dictatorship that started in 1943, and he did the opposite. He destroyed that dictatorship from within to create a democracy. He called for elections and was elected. And in fact, the legacy, he saw fascist politics as toxic in those terms. And all these people from Perón to, or Vargas, to Berlusconi, or Cristina Kirchner, or Hugo Chavez, or whoever you want, including this mix of populists, eventually left and right, they did not engage with these four elements, what I call the four pillars of fascism, which are, and I will say this very briefly, but we can engage with this later. Number one, violence and the militarization of politics. This was central to fascism, and in populism this is not central. Violence doesn't produce many voters, they thought, perhaps they were wrong or not. Acting, like faking that you are a soldier, dressing as a pseudo-soldier with this toy, using guns as a kind of toy, using pseudo-uniforms, basically paramilitary formations. That was a thing of the past. Nobody will dress, on march, like in populist regimes, with guns like this, playing to be a soldier and so on, helmets and all this paraphernalia. Because that was not cool, for politics. It was regarded as, okay, Perón said, using an Argentine slang that someone in the audience might understand, is like he called them piantavotos, which means these kind of things scare voters. If you have guys which are dressed as soldiers, but they are not part of the military, and they are threatening you with their weapons, well, some people might say, this is very problematic, we don't want them close. That's what they used to say in the 20th century. Of course, now, different situation. So one, violence and the militarization of politics, this idea that politics is about, being at war. Second, central, dictatorship. These people, believe in elections. They were authoritarian, but that was an essential element in their, regimes. Number three, lies, and this is, I was very concerned about this issue, so I wrote a book about it, this brief history of fascist lies. And I will give you an example from the Holocaust to understand what is the difference between this particular way of fascist lying and lies in general. Hannah Arendt, a very important philosopher, said, well, since ancient times, politicians lie. It's related to the work of politics. And that is, I'm not criticizing this, but let's be more diplomatic. They exaggerate what they will do or what they are doing. But fascists lie in a different way, because fascists believe in their lies. This is a major difference. But not only they believe in their lies, but they wanted to change the world in order for the world to become what the lies are saying. To change reality in order for reality to be like the lies. And of course, this is extremely dangerous. I will tell you an example. Nazis, of course, said that Jews were dirty and spread disease. It's a huge lie. I mean, it infuriates me just to say this. I mean, it's it's such a lie that it doesn't even need to be explained. And what did they do with this lie? I mean, of course, many, particularly Jews didn't believe that. But what the Nazis did with this lie? So they put Jews in ghettos and concentration camps, horrible sanitary conditions. These poor people, the victims of the Nazis, the Jews, became dirty and spread disease. And the Nazis will say, you see, I was telling the truth. Now, that's my question in this book. That is not the truth. The truth then becomes propaganda converted into reality. That's what the truth is for them. So anyway, that's what I deal with in this book. I mean, incidentally, I start with a quote from the former president of the US, a couple of quotes, and in which Donald J. Trump says, what you are seeing and what you are reading is not what's happening. So that's the kernel of this way of thinking, right? Okay, what I'm seeing is not what's happening. No, you trust the leader that reality is not what you see. And eventually people were killed in the past because of this kind of approach to politics. The last element, so I just was saying 4 elements of fascism, 4 pillars of what fascism is and populism was not, until recently: violence, dictatorship, lies, and last, number 4, politics of extreme xenophobia, which includes, in many cases, anti-Semitism, but as Professor Gurevich was explaining, not always. But this radical hatred for the other, for diversity, which often, if not in all cases, includes forms of racism, is central to a fascist movement. Now, these are elements that combine, of course, what fascism is and was and has been in so many countries, from China to Japan to Argentina to Brazil to India to Germany and Italy. And yet, and of course this connects, then fascism to what happened in the Holocaust. And yet these questions or these connections were not made. So now I would like to talk about 2 dimensions of this problem. One is historiography, the other one is history, basically. I mean, I will make this distinction in order to first deal with historians and then with their sources, meaning people that lived during the period. We call them sources, but that's just a term to explain, or to see, or another one will be testimonies, meaning things that happen in the past that allow us to, or things that happened to people or were said by people that allow us to understand the past. So the first part is historians and their interpretation of the past. Now, in terms of the historiographies of fascism, I will say, if I have to generalize, there were 4 different moments until, from after 45 to the present, in which historians approach the issue of fascism. The early moments was a very strong and understandably so anti-fascist view that explained fascism in ways that did not, it was super global, if you will, but it did not understand the particular national distinctions of all these movements. And how, in fact, there were sometimes integration among them, but also disputes, of course. Because imagine the Fascist International. It's international of people that are as radically nationalist as it can be. So at one point there is a problem. Everybody wants to be number 1. So basically anti-fascists then regarded fascism as a kind of such a global phenomenon that it was not necessarily to understand national histories. And after this there was a reaction. And historians started to stress national histories. And the problem with this is emphasizing all these distinctions with the global dimension of the phenomenon is that the connections were lost. And then fascism was, in the most radical cases of this approach, it was only in fascist Italy you have fascism. That's the way they were called, that's it. And then after this, like in the probably late 1980s and the 1990s, there were another bunch of historians that reacted against that. And they called themselves generic historians of fascism. And they talk again, they wanted to recuperate the earlier versions, in meaning that fascism is a more generic notion. And once again, particular specificities were lost. Now, this these historians started to include the Holocaust as part of their explanation, but in a problematic way, in a way that did not understand the particular distinctions, because at the end of the day, fascism in Italy was not Nazism in Germany. And at the time, all these debates happened in all these different times. The first period of anti-fascism, the second period of national histories, the third period of generic fascism, in different places. Throughout the world, different historians of fascism were addressing these dimensions. And the last period I will call, or the last shift or the last turn, I will call it transnational history of fascism. Meaning historians, I include myself within this group, historians that study national histories but also transnational connections. So yes, they were different, but also they were connected. It sounds obvious, right? And yet it took probably since 1945 to the early 2000s for people to start working this way. Perhaps, and I'm not able at this point to analyze why and how this was the case, but to me, when I started asking the questions in my PhD, it became like I couldn't understand why they were not asking the questions before. Perhaps there were different contexts which were different to the ones I was living in. And among these transnational histories, I would like to mention here in passing works by Reto Hoffman on Japanese fascism, Maggie Clinton on fascism in China, Ben Zakaria on fascism in India. Now, if we switch, by the way, the last period is the moment when we start asking the question of how, because everything is connected, although everything is also different, then why and how the Holocaust is connected to the story. Because once we understand the Holocaust, of course, as a trigger started and, of course, authored by the Nazis, but also an event, and we know more because there are more national histories on this, in which local fascists play an important role in different countries in collaborating with this pan-European project. So the more we see the distinctions, but also the connections, which are transnational, the more we understand the connections between fascism and the Holocaust. In terms of in terms of previous approaches, my general take on them, and I would like to be very polite, is that it's not that they are wrong, but they are not historical enough. And I think we need to do more history here and in order to see these connections. I think, in terms of now, if we switch from historians and fascism to historians and the Holocaust, we see not exactly the same kind of stages, but we see similar trends. After 1945, there were different, basically, I will now generalize and say, mainly two different groups studied the Holocaust, after the Holocaust. I mean, many of them were German historians or historians of German history on one side, and then historians of Jewish history and Jewish studies on the other side. And their focus was extremely different. Whereas the first group tended to see how it worked, generally historians working in the fields of Jewish history and Jewish studies will ask the question of why it happened. Very different, questions to be asked. And again, at one point, like it was a debate among them. Like, is it better to ask the how? Is it better to ask the why? It lasted many decades. I mean, it's kind of surprising. I mean, because why not asking the two questions at once? And that's what we do. Like, we read all these historians and we try to integrate their approaches in order to know more. Of course, now, let me say that I was generalizing. Even a person asking the why will emphasize that dimension rather than the how, and the opposite will happen with someone emphasizing the how. It's not that they were absolutist about this, and yet these were the two dimensions. The majority of them, for different reasons, will not include fascism as part of the analysis. In terms of Jewish history and Jewish studies, the problem of including fascism was, as Saul Friedlander and other historians explain, was that it kind of, or it could be perceived, or it was done in a way that downplay the uniqueness of the Holocaust and the particularity of the experiences of the victims. So that was their concern. And it was, I think, a very fair concern insofar as many of these histories actually did that. They downplay these experiences. But that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that has to be the case. I will return to this in a second. Among German historians or historians of German history, there was another problem. I mean, also good reasons, but another problem, which is the more you de-emphasize the importance of German history, by including Italy and including other countries, perhaps the more you are suggesting that Nazism was not that bad after all if everybody was doing it. I mean, that was so they needed to emphasize only German history, because if you include the Italian fascists, then somehow you are downplaying the negativity of Nazism. So that was the concern. Again, an important concern. So in fact, both of these fields, they were concerned about ahistorical approaches to this issue. And fascism, in a way, sometimes was the vehicle in which these ahistorical views, non-historical views, not contextual enough views were used to downplay the particularities of the event. Now, of course, you know, the Holocaust is unique, but so are other events. So the question is, with respect, trying to analyze the connections, as I said before, but also the differences. The idea of downplaying, especially the experience of the victims, was not necessarily exclusive of historians working on German history. In fact, the author of the most important work, in my opinion, still is on the history of the Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, who authored this magnum opus, The Destruction of the European Jews, downplayed the experience of the victims. He believed, he was Jewish, he had many members of his family died in the Holocaust, but he thought that somehow by studying the perpetrators one could be more objective, and somehow victims in their testimonies were, he said, more biased. I mean, of course, this is extremely problematic. In fact, when I was a graduate student, I wrote an article criticizing this dimension, which of course he didn't like. But again, like this happens